Hello, I'm Jack Blanchard.
And I'm Sam Coates.
And we're inviting you to our homes every Sunday to give you the lowdown on what to expect in the political week ahead.
From Politico and Sky News, this is Politics at Jack and Sam's. Available every Sunday evening, wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Niall Paterson. This is the Sky News Daily, and welcome back to the Conservative Party conference in sunny Manchester. Honestly, some days you wish the weather would just make up its mind. And I suppose, as those attending conference recover from all the parties and discussions in dark corners last night, what people here are wondering is if the country has already made up its mind on Rishi Sunak and the party as a whole. With HS2's northern leg on the verge of being axed, with the recent changes to net zero ambitions, with the policy announcements at conference such as they are, with the polls and the public where they are, is the mood here in Manchester exactly what the Conservatives would have wished? And does anyone sporting a blue rosette see a path to victory at the next election? Well, a little later, I will be digging through the margins of the conference with two former Conservative advisors. But before all that, fresh from her sit-down with the Prime Minister, our political editor, Beth Rigby. Beth, how are you doing?
I'm all right. I'm better now I've done the sit-down. They're quite pressurised things to do.
Before we hear from Rishi Sunak, just explain how these events take place. I've just got this vision of you and the other political editors standing in a corridor somewhere, in a queue, jostling to be first through the door. I mean, how does
It's
it work?
much more controlled than that. For a Prime Minister, the week before conference, he does local radio, and he did dozens of interviews one day. Then he does regional TV interviews, and then he gets to conference and he has a political editor round, and then he does a morning round. So by the time he got to me, because I was last in the queue, he'd done so many interviews, and he sort of plastered a grin on his face. I just thought, I'm sorry, man, you've got me now. But the way it works is the political editors get called up. We go to a waiting room. There's an order in which we go, and we go and sit down in the room. Now, some people will chit-chat. I tend to sort of focus in and try and get into the zone. But when you've got 5 minutes...
5 minutes?
Yeah. But what happens in a round is that you know, they might say 5 minutes. 5 minutes is really a very, very short round. So that's why sometimes... So in the past, you say, why do you interrupt? Because if you don't interrupt... You can't get through any questions. So it would be better if he did them slightly longer. I know I'm just pleading my own cause there.
Let's have a listen then to just one section from your interview with Rishi Sunak, and it was about the election.
If you were really serious about the long term, why don't you just go to the country?
Because that's not what the country wants.
They don't want an election.
I go out and about every day. That is not what anybody wants. What people want is the politicians making a difference to their lives. Right, so I made a big decision on net zero. I'm saving all those families you're talking about £5,000, £10,000, £15,000. And if people want to criticise me for that, they should explain to those families why they think they need to pay an extra 5, 10, 15 grand to do things that aren't necessary for us to hit our net zero targets. I think the British people are completely and squarely behind my approach to net zero. They think it's the right long thing for the country.
You're afraid of an election because you'll lose.
I'm just getting on and delivering for people. You can see that with net zero. You can see it with the number of boat crossings down this year by a fifth. You can see it with our progress on bringing inflation down, helping people. You can see it with the long-term workforce plan, hiring doctors and nurses for the future. These are all things that are going to change our country for the better. It's an example of the type of leadership that I'm bringing.
Nobody wants an election, Beth. Well, I suppose if you're Rishi Sunak or you're a Conservative MP with a majority of less than 20,000, you probably don't want to be going to the polls right now.
No, and actually, if you look at the polling that Sky News have done, I mean, over a quarter of people would like an election before the end of the year, and another quarter would like one in the first quarter of next year. So that's sort of half the population. So no one wants an election. Like, clearly he doesn't want an election because at the moment he's pretty much nailed on to lose. And so if you look at the polls, and so he wants to use this time to close the gap. Look, what we try and do, though, the idea of the interview was, we started off with the premise that this was the Rishi Reset Conservative Party conference. He's really far behind in the polls. This is an acid test. Has he got momentum? He started to put out policies in the run-up to the election. Was this the moment that he sort of seized the day, reset himself, talk to the party. And what's happened is, and you've done loads of party conferences, it's been really chaotic. And in the interview, I said that to him. It's like, no, everyone's got to spring their stuff. And I'm like, they don't. I've done a load of these. You see and feel is that it's a Prime Minister that he's lost control of the narrative around HS2, likely to make the announcement tomorrow, but touring the radio stations and saying he won't. He's got Liz Truss, like, coming like the kingmaker across the water.
Signing copies of the
Signing
budget
copies.
as well.
I went to the event, being mobbed. You've got, like, a cabinet minister freelancing on tax cuts when the Prime Minister, that isn't the line he wants to have. And then Andy Street, the Midlands mayor, publicly begging him in an impromptu press conference not to cut HS2. So you then have to ask the question of, is the reset working? And then,
clearly not.
And then there's a bigger question here. Have you got a mandate, not just from the country, because obviously you didn't go to the polls, but from your party? And if you haven't got a mandate from either, should you take it to the country?
But he would say, and indeed he did say in that interview, you take two of the big kind of significant policy announcements. One is pending, but we know what it's going to be. HS2, but also the kind of the repositioning of the net zero ambition. I mean, he would say, look, I look at these things intently. I wish to take a different approach. I am prepared to do things differently in the best interests of the country. That's his position. It's just whether or not anyone believes that.
So there's an argument on a policy basis that if you are going to take decisions that will affect people for decades to come, which areas around decarbonisation of the economy, or HS2, which is a multi-year or multi-decade project, and you decide to make huge changes on them at a time when you weren't elected by party members, you weren't elected by the public. There's a question about, should he be making those decisions? He'll say yes, because I'm the Prime Minister and it was a Conservative Party mandate. The other question that obviously springs from all of it is, you say that you are making long-term decisions for the country, but the politics of it look like you're taking decisions now in order to try and win an election in 8 months, a year's time.
Also, it's not a decision, though. It's not. The decision on HS2 was taken years ago. This is a reversal of a decision, surely.
Well, so if you take net zero, he will say, I'm making decisions for the long-term future. But he hasn't changed the framework of the policy.
God, no.
He's just changed the things that are immediate in order to appeal to the public. And it's clearly playing well now, which is why in the interview I'm asking about anything but net zero. And he keeps telling me all about his policy, right? And then when you think about HS2, as you've said, this was a project that was announced well over a decade ago. It has been backed by successive Conservative Prime Ministers, and now Rishi Sunak is going to, we think, scrap that northern leg in order to redistribute tens of billions of pounds into other projects that he thinks might appeal to the public. What's he doing? Right, his people around him would say it's no longer value for money. The costs of it's spiraled out of control, and he doesn't want to throw good money after bad. That's what other people...
That's a perfectly arguable
Another
point.
person said to me, a senior party figure said to me the other day, we've spending up to £100 billion on a project that at the start, I think it was forecast to cost about 37 billion. Is that
Even
right?
I think 32.
And the costs are spiraling out of control. It doesn't affect millions of people around the country. And actually, there will be lots of people around the country that would like us to can that project and spend things on other priorities, right? But, you know, cynically, you could say that's a short-term decision in order to shore up support in the run-up to an election.
Yeah, he's a politician. I mean, come on, politicians have done that since time immemorial, particularly when you're in the run into a general election, when you have been in power for over a decade, and when, frankly, there's as much internal dissent in the Conservative ranks at the moment as there is external criticism.
I think that the issue for Rishi Sunak, and has really been thrown into sharp relief at this conference, is that he is a leader, but he is not in control of his party. It's a year before an election. You know the old adage, divided parties do not win elections. This party is divided. He cannot unite them. That is problem one. He's going to have legislation that he wants to put through this year. Are his 60 MPs, the Conservative Growth Group that were flanking Liz Truss in that fringe, a few of them, are they going to back some of his policy decisions and allow him to legislate, right? So he's got a divided party, and the country don't much like him either, according to the polls. And then he's going to make huge decisions, which is why it's a legitimate question to say to him, if you want to do things long term for this country, as you say you do, call an election and get a mandate to do it. And of course he can't. He can't now.
You can't go into a general election on the slogan, long-term decisions for a brighter future. But trying to work out exactly what the Conservative Party stands for right now is pretty difficult, except if you accept his point about HS2 and net zero, that I am doing things differently for the good of the country.
I think what he's doing is he's trying to find a set of policies which is almost like a retail offer, if you like, right? So one cabinet minister said to me the other day, they think this will be a cost of living general election. If the last one was, and this will be about, are these politicians helping me out? And you see, it's like the common sense policies, isn't it? It's kind of like, I'm going to help the motorists. I'm not going to make you green up right now. I'm going to give you some time. HS2, it's a massive amorphous project that, you're not going to get the benefits until 2040, so I'm going to do it for you now. And that's what you're seeing. You're seeing a series of policies, actually a very retail offer that he thinks will swing people back into his column. The one thing I'd say, Neil, just to finish off, is when you talk to people, number 10 have got their tails up. They do think it's much closer than people think. I was told by someone last night that the internal party polling shows that the polls are much, much narrower. They think the Labour vote's soft. They think people will move back into the Conservative column. And they think that they can give the Labour Party a run.
So in one sentence then, how would you describe the mood here in Manchester amongst the senior politicians that you speak to and the grassroots activists that will be coming up to try and speak to you?
I would describe the mood as a complete disconnect between the party leadership and number 10 and how activists and other senior members of the Conservative Party are privately feeling, and some of them vocally feeling. As someone said to me, this is a sense of a damage limitation exercise, but I do think that Rishi Sunak, maybe he is living in a bubble around him, but when he says to me, I completely disagree with your characterisation of conference, I don't think he's spinning me. I think he believes it. But Neil, if you're a Prime Minister that far behind in the polls, you have to believe it, because otherwise you might as well pack up and go home.
Yeah, and unfortunately we don't get to do that until tomorrow. And before we even
I don't even get to go tomorrow, Neil. I'm here till Thursday, baby. Do the podcast on Wednesday and Thursday together.
Oh, God, this is going to...
And then I could put my picture up by yours. So if you're not watching this and you're listening to it, there's a giant picture of Neil behind Neil, which is... it's quite blue steel, actually. I like it. Do you?
Beth Rigby, almost always a pleasure. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Stay right where you are. In just a moment, we will carry on talking about the mood here in Manchester with a couple of former government advisors. Welcome back to the Conservative Party conference, where we are continuing to examine exactly the state of the Conservative Party. I'm joined by two former advisors to the government. Chris White was a former special advisor to William Hague, Andrew Lansley and Patrick McLaughlin in both the Leader of the Commons and Government Chief Whip's office. Katie Perrior is founder and chair of In-House Communications, formerly Director of Communications at Number 10 under Theresa May. Great to see you both. The first question we ask is a pretty straightforward one. How's conference going, Chris?
I think it's pretty interesting. The mood is one I described as a sort of funereal wake, but a positive funereal wake, if I can put it like that.
You can, but you might have to explain.
Yeah, okay. So, I think compared to where we were last year, when the conference at Birmingham was just a complete mess for the Conservative Party, actually Rishi Sunak's done a reasonable job in pulling the party back together, but at the same time, finding that route to victory, I think, is a real challenge. And there's a lot of Tory MPs I've been speaking to over the last couple of days who are quite concerned. They're in the 10,000 plus majority, so they're not in that sort of smaller end of the majority. And I think the route to victory is a challenge that I think a lot of Conservative MPs now just don't see as success. I think the possibility is that they could still do something around denying Labour a majority, but that's still to be seen.
I mean, Katie, so what's been the mood like at the in-house reception? You obviously don't have to name names, but I'm sure you've been asking.
What's great is there's seen so many people here. There was rumour that there wasn't many people going to turn up at conference. I don't think that's the case. It's been a busy period here. Lots of MPs coming and going, lots of ministers having conversations. But what we see sometimes is that they are in the dark. They don't really know what the real theme of this conference is. They don't really know what the vision and the hope is. They are not integrating with the cabinet, and the cabinet are not really connecting with number 10 and number 11 very much. The net zero announcement before conference, they were kept in the dark. The HS2 announcement, they're being kept in the dark. That's not joined up thinking, and I think it's causing them problems.
Specifically what? I mean, this wouldn't be the first time that the Conservative Party was riven by division.
Well, it wouldn't be party conference without a row,
exactly
right? So, and that's what you all come for, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that and the champagne, obviously.
Obviously. And so, yes, there are always problems at party conference. No Prime Minister at the moment has had to deal with so many former Prime Ministers, and they all cause you grief. Boris Johnson is causing grief over HS2, Liz Truss is causing grief over taxes, and had a big tax rally yesterday, which had a queue that was going on for over an hour long. That's where the members wanted to be yesterday. That's a constant challenge for Rishi Sunak.
I suppose, and this is something we covered in the podcast yesterday, perhaps the point is, do we know what the Conservative Party stands for right now? I might have a rough idea what Rishi Sunak on occasion thinks, but I'm not sure that the theme, I'm looking up at the banner there, long-term decisions for a brighter future, and that tells me nothing.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one because actually, we've got this row over HS2 at the moment, and clearly what's being done is short-term decisions to save money rather than actually think about what the long-term infrastructure needs for the country are. So that's a real challenge for the party, and actually there's a lot of, anger, discontentment among SMPs that we've allowed this sort of decision to happen when we're in Manchester and we're actually talking about cutting the northern leg of HS2 when we're in the city. It's just poor management and poor comms. So I think that's a real challenge for the PM that needs to be dealt with. But the one thing I will say, I think some of the net zero announcements and this sort of real focus on the consumer side and actually the cost to taxpayers, what's being put back into people's pocket, actually you can see a path where a lot of MPs are actually quite pleased about that.
Well, there's a narrative there that people
There is a
build
narrative,
upon.
Exactly. Although what I will say is talking to a couple of MPs yesterday who are in Tory Lib Dem marginals, actually that's beginning to play out quite poorly for them in the constituency, and they're becoming quite worried. So, it's a very disjointed, disconnected narrative, and it's one that really the PM and the Downing Street team really need to pull together ahead of the next election.
Whose fault is that, Katie? With your former Director of Communications at Number 10 hat on, the problems must be emanating from Downing Street.
Well, when you are Director of Comms at Number 10, everybody accuses you of having the worst comms record ever, and then someone else replaces it in the next one. So I don't like doing the blame game because I know how hard it is from the inside. However, if you've got a Prime Minister that does have that control, and also not just over number 10 but also number 11, there's rumours about him holding the pen on the autumn statement already, then you don't really share that responsibility in terms of that joint narrative. If you think about take back control, get Brexit done, long term, what was the vision for a long term future? You've lost me.
Yeah.
I don't think it grabs people and they understand. And you could say that long-term decisions for a brighter future on HS2, but the economic case actually doesn't stack up. And the political case, these are sunken votes, doesn't stack up either. So I don't think the advice around him on the issue of HS2 is actually as savvy as he thinks. I think the Liberal Democrats have said in the last few days that it makes Rishi Sunak look like a political genius, or Liz Truss look like a political genius, if you're someone to come to Manchester to tell Manchester you're going to cut them off by their legs. It's not a good look.
You mentioned Liz Truss there. Let's kind of dwell on her speech that she made yesterday, in which she argues building homes, cutting bills, cutting taxes, that's the path forward. There's some genius working there. But I don't really want to focus on the policy idea. But she was feted by everyone. The queue was snaking around the Midland Hotel where this event was taking place. That's not great for Sunak, is it?
It's not great, but you've got to remember that this is a slither of the nation. This does not represent the voting public that's out there.
Oh, no, I understand, but it represents a part of the Conservative Party.
It does, and the Conservative Party, and of course, the weeks and the months and the years to come, there will be a fight for the soul of the Conservative Party. I can tell you that now. There'll be a fight between, whatever happens in this next general election and we move on from that, there'll be a fight about what direction the party's taken it. But you can have your cake and eat it, and this is where I get very frustrated. Because as someone that's been a member of the Conservative Party for over 2 decades, you can be aspirational, you can want to deliver, but you need to show progress, you need to deliver the homes. And the problem is they look back on a decade of Conservative rule, and they think to themselves, what's the legacy? Is it really a white elephant that takes us from nowhere to nowhere? When it comes to a train track, it's not good enough. And that's what Liz Truss is pushing for. She's pushing for more. And I meet cabinet ministers around the conference, and privately they say to me, we've got to remind everybody why we're Conservatives, all right?
She clearly has both eyes on the other side of the general election. So too, I would argue, Suella Braverman. Nigel Farage has also been popping up at this conference quite a lot as well.
I mean, in my day, I'm not even sure I would have allowed Nigel Farage to pass to come into this conference, right?
I genuinely asked that question of myself. Why has he been given a pass?
I don't know, and not something I would support either. And I think it's pretty dangerous territory at times to go down that route, because he's not Conservative. He's not a member of the Conservative Party, and therefore, and I'm not quite sure why he's coming along to this conference.
If he was on the slate, though, he would be the next Conservative leader, wouldn't he?
Well, this is the point, and we talked about the heart and soul and the fight over the future of the Conservative Party, but we talked about disconnect between the Liberal Party here and the Parliamentary Party. But then there's a disconnect between the Liberal Party here, the Parliamentary Party, and the public, and they are the only ones that make matter in this argument, in this debate. And the Conservative Party doesn't seem to remember that. I remember working for Theresa May at Number 10, and she was always took this kind of attitude that you are a servant of the people, you are here to serve. And sometimes I think that we get carried away with ourselves in all this talk.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that Suella and others are beginning to sort of almost jockey for position now and almost try and lay the groundwork for why the prospective defeat that could happen will happen. Exactly. And almost trying to sort of learn the lessons ahead of the defeat to say, actually, we lost because we weren't right-wing enough. Well, actually, if you only have to look at where the majority of the public is to understand that you have to fight in the centre to win.
Basically.
So we'll see where that goes.
I mean, it does sound, from what you were saying, that you could reasonably describe what the Conservative Party is doing right now as preparing for opposition.
Yeah, I don't think anybody looks that far ahead to prepare for opposition in a way, but I think a lot of the MPs are focusing much more on the local side of things, what they're trying to sell themselves, almost trying to win despite, because a few votes here or there for a lot of them can make the difference between coming back in and not coming back in. There needs to be a real focus on the message and what that means. And the current conference slogan, what is it? Long-term decisions for a brighter future. I have to read it. I hate it too. And
it's the third time we've tried to stab at that.
We're sort of stammering over it, and it's not something that you can go on the doorstep to people and actually say, this is something that will make you want to vote for us. What does it even mean?
Don't forget, we've got a really busy time coming up. We've got a King's Speech. The King's Speech, you set out what your plan is for your election, okay? You've then got an autumn statement, so you can start to roll the pitch on potentially tax cuts that might not come in the autumn statement, that might not come until March next year in the spring budget, but you can roll the pitch. But more importantly than that, there's a reshuffle coming up. And some of the behaviours here at conference will be really interesting in how they're rewarded or discounted in the forthcoming reshuffle.
Do the Conservatives stand any chance of winning a majority at the next general election, being the largest party after the next general election?
It's really, really difficult to say yes to that at the moment. But what politics has shown us and what makes it so exciting and why everybody turns up to conferences like this is anything can happen. I remember working for Theresa May just as she went forward for a general election. I decided to opt out at that point. But at that point, she was 24 points ahead in the polls. Jeremy Corbyn was not even considered a risk. Yeah. 2 weeks later, if that campaign had gone on any longer, he would have picked up the keys to Number 10 Downing Street. Okay, that's how quickly you can lose a 24-seat majority. I think the answer to this truly is, what does that campaign look like? Can Rishi Sunak come alive and offer hope and vision on the campaign trail? Can Keir Starmer do that too? The jury's out. How they perform in an election campaign is really, really important. So anything can happen.
We've got an opportunity for the party to really think very hard about the message that it's trying to sell. Clearly there's a lot of wedge issues and a lot of risk that is attached potentially to a Labour government. That's what the party needs to really focus on in terms of saying, actually, are you going to be better off under Labour? What are the risks of Labour getting into power, and actually articulating them and talking about that challenge? It's worked for the party before. I mean, remember in 2015, there was the risk of Labour teaming up with the SNP. Yep. That played really, really well with the electorate. We're not talking about anybody to sort of teaching a grandma to suck eggs here. It's about doing something which actually conveys a message which is both positive and conveys a risk. And if they can do that, then I can definitely see a path to denying Labour a majority. But I think it's a very tall order indeed for the Tories to come out with a majority.
Chris White, Katie Perrior, lovely to have you on the podcast. And dear listener, just before you go, a quick word for you. We would really appreciate you sharing exactly what you think of your podcasts. Be polite, please. If you can, if you have the time, there's a link in the episode description. That's your lot for this edition of the Sky News Daily. We will be back tomorrow when, of course, we will be reviewing Rishi Sunak's speech. See you then.
Hello, I'm Jack Blanchard.
And I'm Sam Coates.
And we're inviting you to our homes every Sunday to give you the lowdown on what to expect in the political week ahead.
Westminster Politics is all about getting ahead of the game. So that's what we're going to try and bring you. An essential briefing packed with all the information you need to start the week.
From Politico and Sky News, this is Politics at Jack and Sam's, available every Sunday evening wherever you get your podcasts.